So I want to get your opinion on the Biden administration so far. So when Joe Biden won the election, the basic concept was dead person who's not going to do a lot. That was pretty much that's pretty much what he was running on. That was sort of the appeal. It was okay, yeah, things were going pretty well economically and even foreign policy wise up until the pandemic. And then Trump says crazy stuff on TV, and he tweets a lot of crazy stuff, and he's incredibly tiring. And so a lot of Americans were like, I just don't want that. So let's find somebody who's almost inanimate, and we'll put that person in office to basically just kind of leave things alone and bring us back to some sort of stasis. And instead, Joe Biden comes in and he immediately starts talking about world-breaking change. He's going to do Build Back Better. He's going to blow out the spending. He's going to completely remake where we are in terms of foreign policy by both pulling out of Afghanistan and then getting us involved in a pretty protracted conflict in Ukraine. And Americans are looking at all this and going, I don't understand what you are doing or why you are doing it. What could Joe Biden do you think, to pull out of the tailspin? Or do you think this was sort of baked into the cake, that the establishment politics are just such that this was going to happen no matter what?
I think this is going to happen no matter what. I covered Biden's campaign until, of course, he stopped campaigning. The obvious idea behind Joe Biden was they looked at what happened in 2016 and they saw Hillary Clinton ran as an insider. Like, her whole pitch to America was, I've been in Washington for 25 years. I know how things work. You can trust me at 3 o'clock in the morning when there's a crisis. But that's classic Democratic Party. They had no sense that the entire population, the one thing they hated most at that time was the political insider. So of course that was a disastrous philosophy. The whole idea behind Joe Biden is he has like this sliver of credibility as an ordinary person through his Scranton Joe persona, this idea that he comes from a family that, in some distant way is working class. But he of course hasn't governed that way, right? And he's governed essentially through this upper class elite politics that makes no sense to most of America, and it doesn't translate well on television, and it particularly doesn't translate when the guy's basically a corpse who doesn't understand what he's saying on TV. So I think they're in a lot of trouble. I mean, I don't know exactly what they're going to run on. The midterms have already looked like they're a disaster that is going to happen. But what happens in the next presidential election is an even bigger mystery. I have no idea where they're going with that.
I mean, it looks as though what they really want to run on is Trump, because Biden beat Trump. And so if he just keeps running against Trump, then he thinks that he's going to win. I think that what he fails to recognize is a couple of things. One, Trump actually is not on the ballot in 2022, and who knows whether he'll be on the ballot in 2024. That's becoming more and more of an issue. But beyond that, the referendum is now on you. You're the president of the United States, and you're not just the guy who gets to sit outside and critique the guy who's tweeting on the toilet. You're the one who actually is in charge of things. And Joe Biden seems to have this tendency to treat his presidency as though he were an observer to his own presidency. He'll say things, and it appears that he's just been made aware of them. Or he'll yell at or he'll just yell at gas companies. He'll be like, why don't you guys just produce more? And it's like, well, I don't know how you think government works, but you yelling at people is not typically how government works or how policy works. And so I wonder, they really are doubling down on a lot of the January 6th kind of stuff. I wonder how you think that's playing or what you think that impact has.
I don't think that stuff works. Again, you go back to 2016, Hillary Clinton, if I remember correctly, 90% of the money she spent on advertising was on negative ads. They had made a decision, essentially, they were going to run on Trump's negatives, and they thought that was going to get them across the goal line, and it didn't. They spent 4 years of Trump's presidency essentially doing the Russiagate thing and trying to run against that, and then it was Ukrainegate, and they tried to run against that, and they never came out with like a positive plan for what their theory was of how they were going to get ordinary America back on its feet, how they were going to, restore jobs in places that, had lost them. And they're still not doing that. They still think it's a political, there's some kind of easy political fix to the question of getting elected. I think they just lucked out, frankly, that the pandemic hit. Had it not been for that, they might even have lost in 2020. Going forward, if they think they're going to win because of January 6th, regardless of what I might think about that or anybody else might think about that. I think they're deluded. It's the same delusion that got them into trouble in 2016.
You know, one of the fascinating things that I think has happened in Democratic politics is, as we started off the conversation with, the kind of unwillingness to run on a broad populist message. Even Bernie Sanders, right? His basic idea, which was this broad kind of socialistic populism, was that it is equally appealing to all racial groups. I'm not going to campaign. He made this pretty clear in 2016, for example. I'm not going to campaign on the basis of race-specific policies. I'm just going to say that a rising tide lifts all boats. And so if we redistribute the way that I want to redistribute, everyone will be helped. My solution to racial inequality is going to be effectively a socialist redistribution. It's an economic populist message that is not racially specific. And he was hit so hard by the racialized left that he then went woker in 2020, to no effect, by the way. He earned no additional votes based on that. And it feels like that's been the direction of the Democratic Party for quite a while. And it almost feels like it's been that way really since 2012 or so. Then in 2008, Barack Obama ran as a great unifier. We're moving past our racialized moment. We're going to, in my person, I'm a unifying figure. And then he governed to the left. And by 2012, he had basically stopped with a lot of the unifying rhetoric on things like race. And it was about how his son could have been Trayvon Martin. And what happened in Ferguson, Missouri was indicative of broader national trends with regard to race. And the Democratic Party fell in love with this theory that they could replicate what Obama did in 2012, which was actually not a replicable phenomenon. In 2012, he cobbled together this heavily multiracial, college-educated white ladies coalition. And the Democratic Party, I think, figured from there on in, this was going to be the coalition. And they failed to recognize a couple of things. One, Barack Obama was a unique candidate. And two, that was a unique point in time. And maybe a third thing, which is that when you create a racialized population, there's going to be a backlash. And that backlash includes a huge percentage of white Americans and maybe people who don't want to identify as racially essential members of a group, as you're seeing with Hispanics now, who are going to say, well, I'm not really interested in this kind of politics.
I know Bernie pretty well. Like I go back with him a long way back in 2005. I did a story with him where he invited me to hang out for a month in Congress. He was still in the House back then. He wanted people to know how the House worked. And he did something that no normal politician would do, which is just take me on a tour of how everything works. The Rules Committee, who's influencing what. And you're absolutely right. In 2016, he was drawing blood on Hillary Clinton early in that race. And when he started going after her about her connections to these big banks that were paying her these massive amounts of money for speaking fees, and a lot of these were the same banks that had gotten people into trouble in 2008. The Democratic Party tried all these responses, and none of them worked until Hillary did this thing that I think was brilliant, but it radically changed the direction of the Democratic Party. She said, well, if we broke up all the banks today, would that end racism? And it just deflected the conversation. And I think for somebody like Bernie, and I don't want to psychoanalyze him, but for somebody who's grown up in kind of the left liberal ecosystem, the worst thing in the world is to be accused of being like racially regressive, to be or being a bigot. I think it was paralyzing to his campaign. I think he struggled with it throughout the rest of 2016, and he definitely struggled with it in the 2019-2020 race. And it took him away from that message that I think was working. He was saying a lot of the same things, oddly enough, that Donald Trump was saying that year. Trump even said that on the stump. I remember listening to Donald Trump saying, Bernie and I, we have a lot in common. We're saying a lot of the same things. I think the media is trying very hard to prevent people from realizing that populist message, if somebody were to try it, would really work. And Bernie made a big mistake, I think, tactically by going away from that.
Okay, so I want to talk about that sort of populist message because you're exactly right. I mean, and you see it across the board, right? You see Donald Trump praising, for example, Bernie Sanders, or Tucker Carlson praising Elizabeth Warren's economic plan, right? That actually has happened on the air at Fox News. And you start thinking to yourself, okay, well, that's an interesting sort of horseshoe. Or is what we're really seeing just kind of back to what we were talking about before, that the critique of the institutions is clearly correct? It's just that everybody has wildly variant solutions to the critique on the institutions, meaning that I look at Wall Street and I say, listen, I love capitalism. I'm a huge capitalism fan. Wall Street is not engaging in capitalism. They're engaging in a sort of predatory practice whereby they work hand in glove with the government and then use their power to promote ESG ideals within the corporations in which they invest. And people on the left say, well, no, the corporations are the bad guys. And if there were more government control to break up those corporations, then this would somehow foster greater fairness. I wonder whether, in fact, sort of the temporary agreement is false, is I guess what I'm asking.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I covered the aftermath of 2008 for nearly a decade. And I watched numerous scenes. One comes to mind. I covered a foreclosure court in Jacksonville, Florida. If you remember, they were foreclosing on so many people, they had to bring judges out of retirement to do these things called rocket dockets, where they were essentially, you would go into a conference room and a judge would throw somebody out of a house every 3 minutes or so. And they would be, these old doddering 80-year-old judges. Well, the people in those rooms, they weren't left or right. They were both Republicans and Democrats. The victims of the 2008 crash, and I actually agree with your analysis. I think it was a perversion of capitalism. Most of my sources back then were Wall Street people. They were people who were saying the real problem is that the bailouts are picking winners and losers. They're giving unfair advantages to these gigantic, too big to fail banks. And they're letting these mid-sized regional banks fail. And that's not really capitalism, right? Like, that's not the Adam Smith ideal. We should let failures fail and, let the chips fall where they may. But it's definitely true that people on both the left and the right, poor people, middle-class people, working-class people, they've both gone through the same things. They've both been affected in the same ways, and they have a lot of the same common interests. The critique and the answers may be different according to whatever politicians they follow, but I think they have a lot in common. And I think that there's one of the main motives of kind of the divisive media model that we have today is to keep people from realizing that they have those common interests.
So let's talk about the media for a second, because I totally agree, obviously, with your critique of the media. I do wonder whether when we talk about, media figures being widely trusted, it may be that that's impossible simply because the internet basically ended that era, that it was easy to say, I trust Walter Cronkite when he was one of 3 people on TV who was talking about news. It's a lot harder to say, here is a guy I trust when you have 100 different sources and they're all critiquing each other. And usually there's something to many of the critiques. And so, listen, we have Daily Wire. We are obviously a right-wing company. We make no bones about that fact. At the bottom of every one of our articles, literally every one, we have a disclaimer at the bottom saying we are a conservative media company. Everything that we do is through the lens of our values, which, frankly, I think is significantly more honest than most of the other media companies that claim that they have no bias whatsoever, but that they are just speaking the pure, unadulterated truth. And then you have like Brian Stelter promoting whatever on CNN. The breakdown in the media, I agree with you that it is so important that there's not even a common, they always say there's not a common set of facts, but there really is not a common set of facts. And that is not because people on the right are lying about the facts invariably. That is because very often the mainstream sources are obscuring the actual facts in paragraph 17 of a New York Times article where the headline is actually wrong. They'll put the facts in, but it's buried in paragraph 17.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm kind of the inverse of what your model is, right? Like I grew up reading Hunter Thompson and Tom Wolfe, and I always thought, and my father was a newsman, by the way. He was a TV reporter, and he was like a straight news reporter. He did one editorial his entire life. Everything was sort of just the facts man with him. I went the other way. I liked the idea of being an editorializing, funny writer, but letting people know exactly what I thought about things at all times. I always thought that was more honest than like the New York Times model where, the biases are frankly hidden, right? Whether they put a headline on page 4 or page 1, or whether it's in a big font or a little font, these are all editorial decisions. They matter. And it's a signal telling you what the organization thinks about the subject. However, I do think we lost something when those companies went away from the, let's just say, the objectivity as an aspiration, right? I think that was important when news companies tried at least a little bit to be down the middle, right? To present both sides of an issue, to not care so much about what the impact of a news story was. I think that was important. I think you need to have both kinds of media, right? You need to have the overtly subjective media that tells you exactly what they think, and then I think there's value to that other kind that says, look, I'm just trying to get to the bottom of this. Here, I'll tell you this fact, and then you decide for yourself what you want to do about it. And we've lost that. I think in the modern media landscape, that doesn't exist anymore, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, I think one of the analogs in the modern media landscape where there actually is, open bias is one of the things that I say on my show all the time, and I literally say this, I would say at least once a week, is I'll get a question from somebody, how do I ascertain the truth about a particular story? What I say is I want you to listen to my podcast, and then I want you to listen to Pod Save America. And where we agree on the facts, that's going to be the common core of facts, and everything else is going to be the opinion that is drawn therefrom. And that seems like a fairly, where the lines intersect, that dot is going to be the common core of facts. The problem is Dan Pfeiffer goes on MSNBC and he literally says on MSNBC that Facebook should shut down all of our traffic to Daily Wire. So the feeling that I get is like, I'm trying to say, fine, listen to anything. I'll go on Bill Maher's show and Bill Maher will come on my show and it'll be great. There's a whole side of the aisle that's like, no, it is a false objectivity to even promote the idea that there is another idea. So there should not be another idea. And so whatever we say goes. And if you controvert that narrative, then you're immediately barred from the club.
Yeah, and that's just a losing argument with most audiences. I mean, people implicitly distrust anyone who doesn't want you to listen to someone else's argument, right? And that used to be something that attracted me, frankly, to the liberalism, was this idea that I don't care what that person says. I believe what I believe, and you can watch that or listen to that if you want. It doesn't bother me, right? Well, that's not the attitude anymore. The attitude is, we have to do everything we can to stamp out disinformation or misinformation or whatever it is. Like that's going to change something, or like that's going to have a positive impact on audiences. It has the opposite. I think it has a tendency to inspire audiences to trust people in the opposite direction if you do that. So this censoriousness, this new idea of kind of stamping out the other side completely in the hope that you'll be the last opinion standing. That's a losing strategy, I think, and it's incredible to me that it's been adopted.